Welcome to The Inquiry. I'm Charmaine Cozier. Each week, one question, four experts, and an answer. Elon Musk, Barack Obama, Kanye West, Kim Kardashian and Uber have millions of Twitter followers between them. One day in July, they appeared to be in a very generous mood. Their verified accounts posted similar messages promising to give back to fans by doubling all payments sent to various Bitcoin addresses within a strict 30-minute deadline. But it was a scam. They'd been hacked. Twitter employees had been tricked into revealing security information. At least $120,000 was paid over by people who thought the tweets were real. A cryptocurrency exchange blocked another $280,000 from being sent out. Investigators were quick to act. A 19-year-old from the UK and a 17 and 22-year-old from Florida were arrested and charged. It's just one example of a crime that targets people all over the globe. So this week we're asking, can the world stop online fraud?
Part 1. White Hat Hacking.
Unfortunately, fraud happens extremely quickly. I can usually gain access to money or data in less than 5 to 10 minutes.
Rachel Toback is CEO of Social Proof Security. She hacks businesses for a living.
So companies hire me to tell them where their vulnerabilities are in their systems so that I can help them patch them by telling them exactly how I would gain access to their data or their money.
That's known as white hat hacking. It's done with the full permission of the firms involved. Rachel knows how hackers think. Her interest started at DEF CON, the world's largest hacking convention. She entered the Capture the Flag contest, which involved breaking into a company network in front of a live audience. She came second for 3 years in a row and was surprised at how easy it was.
It can definitely seem innocent, but it can turn pretty malicious fast because I'm able to steal your money.
Fraudsters have thousands of cover stories, but the end goal is always the same: to trick people out of cash or possessions. Rachel says they have options for how to do that. Login details stolen during a data breach from one company, often using software or viruses called malware, are used to infiltrate customer accounts at another.
Malware attacks are very scary for organizations too because they're able to siphon out all of their data, things like usernames, passwords, addresses, phone numbers. And when I have that information as an attacker, I'm able to leverage that information later down the line and log in to other accounts that you might control.
It's called a credential stuffing attack. It assumes people use the same email and password for different sites, which they do. This month, government agencies in Canada, including its online tax revenue service, were hit by a credential stuffing raid. Details of thousands of citizens were exposed. Fraudsters used some of those accounts to apply for COVID-related grants, then took the cash. Online fraud can happen in many ways. You might transfer money to a person or company you know, unaware that their email and bank details have been manipulated and redirected to strangers.
And the reason why we're able to do that from an attacker mindset is because we use what's called OSINT, open source intelligence. We look up everything about you. We can figure out who your assistant is, who your accountant is on LinkedIn. We know what emails you use from screenshots that you've put on your Instagram to show how well you're working under coronavirus at home. All of those add up to tell a really strong story to make us be able to pretend to be somebody to steal your data or steal your money very quickly.
Many shopping sites and banks have two-factor systems where access to personal data only happens after a code sent to your phone is entered. Rachel says it's effective, but warns fraudsters are always looking for loopholes.
For instance, if you are always tweeting at a specific company that manages your phone, well, now I can call up that company and attempt to do what's called an account takeover. I can try and get them to give me access to your phone. And if I have that, I can reroute your two-factor codes, those codes you use to log into your email or your bank, to my phone, my attacker-controlled phone.
A lot of online fraud exploits basic human emotions, a desire to help someone in need who's gained your trust. Rachel says that's one reason why it's so hard to stop.
Unfortunately, the law enforcement authorities can't keep us safe because new phishing or malicious domains come out every single minute of the day. We develop these exploits as attackers so quickly, there is no possible way, even if they had a task force of 10,000 people, there's no possible way that they could find all of them as they come out.
Part 2. Inaction, Fraud.
The legislation is there. The Fraud Act is a prime example that covers the majority of fraud offences. It's just the fact that we're not investigating and we're not prosecuting. My name's Tamlin Edmonds and I'm a partner and specialist prosecutor with a law firm called Edmonds Marshall McMahon.
Tamlin is a fraud expert. Her UK-based firm only handles private prosecutions. She says online scams can't be stopped because limited resources mean too many cases don't make it to court.
So in my previous life, I was a government prosecutor, and myself and two colleagues identified, this was back in 2012, that there were massive cutbacks across government agencies, and certain types of crime, particularly fraud, were no longer being prioritised. Specialist economic crime teams were being closed down, and these cases weren't being investigated and prosecuted properly. So that's why we set up this firm to offer victims of crime the right to still get justice, but without having to rely on the state.
Clients include individuals, companies and charities.
Everything we do now is online, which is why online fraud is so prominent.
These criminals don't worry about getting caught. In 2019, the results of an inquiry from a watchdog with responsibility for the inspection of police services in England and Wales found one force that didn't investigate 96% of cases it received, despite there being strong evidence, including suspects.
The main challenges are a lack of police engagement. Unfortunately, in England and Wales, certainly there's been a huge reduction in police numbers, a 14% reduction, in fact, since 2009. And therefore, that means that the police are acting with limited resources to investigate all crime.
Tamlin's work involves chasing money all over the world, but when it gets to countries like the United Arab Emirates or UAE, things get difficult.
So the biggest issues we found, certainly now that the fact that fraud is becoming far more international, is following the money. You will often come to a point where you can't go any further with certain jurisdictions. So, for example, personally, I've had a huge amount of problems getting information or finding out where money has gone once it hits the UAE. It's impossible to get any engagement, from my personal experience, from the banks there, or it is difficult to get engagement with law enforcement.
So the criminals carry on and prosper. For those that do call the police, responses can be far from instant, as one of Tamlin's clients based outside the UK discovered. It was a business email compromise scam.
It was a huge amount. It was about 2.5 million. So that company contacted the police in this jurisdiction to report it, and were told to report it via Action Fraud. But then what happened is that they received a holding response from Action Fraud that said that they would receive a response within 28 days.
Action Fraud is the first stop for reporting fraud and cybercrime in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. During that 28 days, reports are reviewed to screen for potential cases which can be sent to police forces to investigate. That delay is a gift for criminals.
So, you've got a fraud that
is in motion and there was a possibility to stop it. But to say that you will receive a response within 28 days, they're just not acting quickly enough. So that victim had to then turn to civil remedies, so instruct us as a law firm here to get a freezing injunction to prevent that money moving quickly.
A worldwide freezing injunction is granted by a high court. It can be in place within 24 hours and shuts down the ability of criminals to access the cash they've stolen. It helped Tamlin's client to recover most of their money. There's another challenge with online fraud. Knowing where a suspect is doesn't necessarily mean they'll be caught.
That can happen. I had one particular case where the defendant was in this particular jurisdiction and then did a runner to another jurisdiction and is still there because that particular jurisdiction, it is incredibly difficult to extradite from. And he was responsible for a huge fraud.
So what can you do in those circumstances?
Well, for victims, one of the things that we do is just to try and recover the funds, because often victims want the money back as priority, and which is why we use civil remedies in order to freeze bank accounts. You can get an international freezing order and enforce that in other jurisdictions.
Even if there were more prosecutions, we heard from our first expert, Rachel Toback, that scams are coming too fast to keep up.
I have a huge amount of sympathy for the police and the amount of pressure that is on them to investigate other types of crimes. And so it's just a greater resource, really, that is required to investigate these types of offences.
Isn't this an area where the criminals will always be one step ahead, regardless of how well a country is resourced?
Unfortunately, I would tend to agree with you. I think there has to be a greater awareness amongst the general public so that people are aware of the types of scams that are out there, because fraudsters will always adapt.
Part 3. Q.
My name is Muhammad Imran, and I am a criminal intelligence officer with the Financial Crimes Unit at the Interpol Global Complex for Innovation in Singapore.
Interpol is the world's biggest international police agency. It coordinates investigations between forces around the world. 194 countries are members.
In terms of Interpol's work in this area, we've seen plenty of successes.
One of those successes is a case with the codename Operation Raven. Towards the end of 2018, an email which looked like it came from an authorised member of staff tricked a company out of €110,000.
There's quite a range of the online fraud that we see, and some of the common ones are business email compromise, or what we like to call as BEC fraud. That's where the recipient is actually induced to conduct unauthorized transfers of funds. It was pretty interesting because this business email compromise scams targeted companies in Europe, and it started with one particular company in Norway.
5 months later, a 35-year-old man was under arrest in Nigeria on 45 charges related to cybercrime, fraud and money laundering. Forces from different countries worked together to link evidence back to the suspect.
When our colleagues from the Nigerian Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, EFCC, actually went into the case, they managed to actually trace more than 10,000 CEOs and financial accountants worldwide, particularly in Europe and South America.
That's the kind of data that's worth millions in the wrong hands.
So authorities believe the suspect and his accomplices had access to multiple bank accounts to receive and launder the proceeds of the fraud, with up to about $3 million suspected of passing through the hands of the criminals.
It's impossible to know exactly how much money has been stolen across the world through online fraud. Tracking stolen cash is another reason why cases can be hard to crack.
Every time there's an online fraud, it almost definitely goes hand in hand with money laundering between several countries. More often than not, the level of detection is not so high because criminal syndicates and they commonly use money mules and shell companies to mask their identities. And this, from a law enforcement perspective, I think it complicates the process.
A money mule transfers stolen money for someone else, either electronically or physically. They might know what's going on, or they could be an innocent scam victim. Shell companies are legal. They don't have any business activities and can be used to disguise who owns assets like property or cash. It means unravelling the money trail can take time. How likely is it that if someone is a victim to this, either as a company or an individual, that they will get all of their money back?
The likelihood of getting all of the money back, it's highly improbable. Why? Because as you work through the funds tracing along the way, there are commissions being paid out, payments being made to other third parties. So the fact of the matter is, to get 100% back is very unlikely.
Mohammed believes fraudsters can be stopped if countries pool their investigation resources. As for anyone considering a career in cybercrime, there are a couple of things that might make it less attractive.
When there is a successful case being conducted, the sentences that the person is being convicted of must be severe enough to ensure that this deters others. At the same time also, disrupting criminal proceeds is just as important, as I said, and slowly but surely, the word gets around between criminal networks. Obviously, at the back of their mind, when they know that the funds are being frozen or they do not benefit from it, it will dampen their spirits.
Part 4. Global Problem, Local Solutions.
This is a global problem with criminals on every continent, but the response can't just be international, it must be local too.
There will always be criminals, so it cannot be stopped, but it can be better handled. And justice can be served when a victim is deprived of his right or of its belonging.
Stefan Kanan is a cybersecurity consultant based in the Ivory Coast. He advises African governments on cybersecurity, cyber defence and cybercrime issues on the continent. He says blanket solutions can be ineffective. Understanding local conditions is vital for reducing online fraud. He's seen that through his work.
The Ivory Coast was considered from 2005 as one of the safe havens for cyber criminals in Africa. The same way as Nigeria was in the Anglophone part of the continent. There was much activity and much negative press in the Ivory Coast about the cyber criminal in the country. So the government was a bit concerned and wanted to address the subject.
The attraction for criminals was clear. They were unlikely to get caught.
In the 90s, in my country, there were a lot of bank robberies by very young actors, 16 years old and on. And all of a sudden, 15 years later, the bank robberies completely disappeared. Just because to conduct a bank robbery, you need, first of all, a lot of logistics, you need weapons, and you carry the risk of being physically armed. And the reward, the money that you can get from a bank branch is not that important. So those criminals shifted to the cybercrime because the investment to conduct the criminal activity was low. The risk was almost zero. Then
the price of going online fell dramatically.
The cost of broadband is the entry to cyberspace. So in my country, this cost went from about $200 15 years ago that was needed to get connected to the internet to $1 today. That has brought, of course, a boom of users. And you can see very clearly when you look at the African map and you look at the cybercrime map, a direct relation with the boom of digitalization with the number of cybercrime cases.
The rapid rise of mobile phone banking created even more opportunities to manipulate people into disclosing security details.
The main target of cybercriminal in my region is mobile money activity and mobile money wallets in general. We have gone from 0 to 19 million accounts, mobile money accounts in my country alone in 5 years, whereas it took banks 20 years to get 600,000 accounts. And those accounts are on mobile phone, basically. Your bank account is on your phone, because most of the population, or a large part of the population, is illiterate, is quite naive when it comes to technology and to the use of technology. So it's quite easy for cyber criminals to divert the money that is on those wallets to their account.
It also changed the pattern of online fraud in the Ivory Coast. Cyber criminals could prey much closer to home.
Oh yes, now it has really shifted. 2012, 60% of the victims of Ivorian cyber criminals were abroad, and mainly in France, Canada, French part of Canada, Quebec, Switzerland, and Belgium. Now it has reverted to being the opposite, where 60% of the victims of Ivorian cyber criminals are Ivorian from Côte d'Ivoire. So as technology evolved very fast, the trend also is evolving. And we see that foreign victims are less attractive now than the local victims.
The adverse consequences of digitalisation could have been overwhelming for authorities, but the government was worried about its reputation, so made online fraud a priority. By 2013, 3 laws had been passed covering cybercrime, data protection and electronic transactions. So can the world stop online fraud? It can only be dealt with if countries treat it as a priority. Even very rich countries are not doing enough. When one scam ends, more spring up to replace it. But you don't always have to catch the criminal in order to recover the cash. Shutting down multiple accounts used to launder proceeds is the most effective deterrent for money-hungry crooks. For that to work, banks have to move faster when their customers complain. Stolen cash doesn't stay still. It's also down to us. Let's go back to our first expert, professional hacker Rachel Toback, who has some simple advice. Have separate passwords for everything.
One of my biggest tips that I have for you to stay safe from attackers like me is to make sure that you do not reuse your password.
The inquiry was presented by me, Charmaine Cozier, and produced in London by Diane Richardson.
Have you ever felt like leaving everything behind and starting your life over again from scratch? Just go one evening and never come back.
The things he took were his backpack, clothes, mobile phone, wallet, his glasses, and what he was wearing on that day.
In Japan, this is possible and not that uncommon. You make a phone call and one of the so-called night moving companies will help you disappear.
I picked up only my dog and some clothes and left with my car. And I realized this night moving business is possible.
As part of a new series called Rule Breakers in the documentary podcast, I'll be introducing stories like this that challenge conventions.
Put simply, I got fed up with human relationships. I came here because nobody knows me.
So please join me, Shireen Nishat, on the documentary podcast from the BBC World Service.
Take care, I said, and I cried.
Just search for the documentary wherever you get your podcasts.